She and Namkia had this arrangement that if the Japanese really got too close, then he was to cut off her head and present it to the Japanese so that they would leave the villagers alone. She had pretty thoroughly integrated, and probably most important element in that is the fact that she learnt the language quickly, to the extent that she just stopped dreaming in English and she started dreaming in Zeme.
How did she convince the locals that this wasn't just the British people's war, but it's your war too?
With great difficulty.
I mean, that's sort of what I've noticed, is that I think people these days, they're not listening when people are talking. They're just sort of waiting for their turn to talk. You know, I think we're in that culture where everything needs to be fast. So it's hard.
I don't think that's new. I think people have probably always been like that. But it may be worse now. Internet, social media, all the technology that we're exposed to, it may be worse now.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you say that that's always been that way. Do you think that's sort of like us as human beings, that we always have that narcissistic trait, that we like the sound of our own voices kind of thing?
I rather think so. I'll tell you something. Years ago, when I was growing up, you entertained people by having them round for cocktail parties, drinks parties before lunch. And as a teenager, I had to go to these parties and I was quite shy. So I said to my mother, why do I have to do this? And she said, well, you have to learn. And what you do is that everybody likes talking about themselves. So what you do is you ask people questions, then you don't have to talk. And that's a skill that's been with me all my life. And it's a naughty game. But if I'm feeling naughty, I can do this. If I really like the person, perhaps I won't do it because it's manipulative. Say we haven't really met before. If at the end of that dinner, I will know a lot about them and they will know virtually nothing about me. I'm using that narcissism against them, which is not. It's not a nice trait, and I don't do it very often.
And the fascinating part about that is that they don't even know it themselves. All they think is that this is an amazing conversation. I'd like to talk to her again one day.
Absolutely. They love it. You've made them very happy.
Right. So it's one of those things that you have to sort of play it at the right time.
And you may meet somebody who has the same skill. So then, then you've got a really interesting situation.
We're both playing the same game here. What are you doing? Well, podcasting is sort of like that. So, I mean, growing up in there, as a teenager, you were going to like cocktail parties. I'm sure like your social etiquette, your social awareness was just off the charts by the time you reached adulthood at that point, right? Because you were trained in a way so young.
Britain was a very class-ridden society, but in a way those kind of skills were also useful. As a life skill.
Well, when I think about arguments, when I think about debates, and I think of that word, like being diplomatic, immediately in my mind, like the sort of the British, that culture comes into mind. And I think part of that has to do with this class, like you're taught certain manners, how to talk to people, how to speak, even if you don't like someone or you want to portray a certain, you could say disgust for someone, there's a very roundabout way of doing it.
Absolutely.
And that's something I've really admired.
I was having a conversation about this in the office the other day. Somebody says something at a meeting, for example, that you absolutely don't agree with. In fact, you completely disagree. But you say, that's a very interesting idea. Which is code for you're talking absolute nonsense.
Well, I think that's where the famous British dry humor comes from, right? It's sort of this sarcastic way of replying to something, and it's all within the tone.
That's absolutely true. And our irony. Sometimes you might compliment someone on how they're dressed and actually perhaps mean the opposite. Nagas are different because they do tend to get it. But among my Indian friends, I can't use my sense of humour because good British friends insult each other. We don't mean it, but anybody listening to our conversation would think we were deadly enemies, but we know exactly what we're doing. And for me, it's a huge relief when I meet somebody like that we can exchange insults and they're not going to take it badly. But with Indian friends, you can't do that. And the other thing you can't do, the British tend to be quite self-deprecating and run themselves down. That's but that's part of the humour. But if I do that with one of my Indian friends, they get tremendously embarrassed, not kind of get it. So I've had to tone all that down,
Right.
which is quite an effort, really.
I can imagine. And I think that goes for even male relationships, you know, like that's sort of our term of endearment with each other, is sort of this banter between us.
Banter is the thing. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And it's also interesting to me that you said that you were very shy, which is sort of quite the opposite of your mom, right? She was known to be very extroverted.
She was very assertive, very determined, and if things were not right, she would not hold back in telling you exactly what she thought. But no, I'm more like my father in that respect. He was a very shy man. Really?
Was that interesting as well, growing up with two different dynamics of parents with those different personalities?
Yes, but I mean, my mother couldn't have married anybody else. I mean, she was such a forceful character. My dad was certainly a strong and brave person. The things he did in the war, he never put himself forward, was always self-deprecating, and but had a great sense of humour. When my mother was kind of being all sort of fireworks and things, I mean, he would just smoke his pipe and, you know, kind of just wait for the storm to blow over. You know, he was that kind of character. And they both had a tremendous sense of humour. My mother had a huge fund of funny poems and songs, which she used to tell us, especially on long car drives. My father used to make up funny poems. I mean, something would happen. He'd go a bit sort of quiet for about 5-10 minutes. And when you got to know him, you knew he was thinking of a little poem. Do you want one?
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay. Well, the thing is, we always used to, as a family, we used to do the washing up. We didn't have a dishwashing machine or anything like that. We noticed that you think you've cleaned all the family stuff and you've put it all away and everything's finished. But then somebody finds that really sticky, fatty, greasy saucepan that's got forgotten.
At the bottom, right?
Somewhere at the bottom, yes. And so there's always one thing more. So this poem went, when the time has come to draw your harp and halo, and you think you're done with every earthly chore, then Satan says, you sinner, go and clear the angels' dinner, 'cause there's always one thing more.
Well, it's interesting because that sort of humor, and one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on is just because like of this fascination with your mom. I think a lot of people have that here as well. And I think on first glance, when you read about your mom, Ursula Graham Bower, you would get this notion, okay, there's this lady who wanted to live in the jungle and, you know, help these tribal people. But then you look at her backstory, the fact that she studied at the School of Rodin, an all-girls school, and which is one of the most prestigious schools. It could be the equivalent to it is to a Harvard, but it's more like a high school education kind of thing, right? And you realize that this is a very well-educated woman. This is someone who used her privilege and realized that one part of the world really needed her help. And so she stepped up, and just a chain of events that led to her coming to the Northeast. It's very fascinating.
She fought to go to this girls' school because of the social circle she came from. They didn't, which is very sort of Victorian, Edwardian, you know, girls didn't really need an education. But my mum was academic from the very beginning, and she fought to go to Rodin. And the other thing was that my mother's family, on the male side, they were all adventurers. They climbed mountains. They went on punitive expeditions in Arunachal Pradesh. One of them was killed by cannibals in the South Seas. Somebody else was killed on the northwest frontier. They all joined the army, the Indian Army, the Navy. Tremendous set of adventurers. And she was brought up with all those stories. And at the age of 3 or something, she cried buckets of tears because she was told that as a girl she couldn't go into the Royal Navy. So she had this sort of driving thing that she wanted this life of adventure. She also then, as she grew up, she wanted both. She wanted an academic life as well. But there was the financial crash of the 1930s. So she was told that she must leave school and that her dreams of going to university could not be fulfilled because there was only enough family money to send either her or her brother to university. And of course, it was thought to be much more important to send her brother to university. And she was bitterly disappointed, absolutely heartbroken. She wants to go and do something with her life, not just settle down. And then, as you say, to escape from London and all the cocktail parties and that, she used to go up to the west coast of Scotland and go walking in the mountains there. And there she met Alexa MacDonald. They went on a fishing expedition together and got talking and really bonded. A few months later, Alexa's brother was posted to Manipur. You're quite right about that, about Manipur. And as he wasn't married at the time, he needed somebody to run his household and organise his dinner parties. Here we are, back to dinner parties again. And Alexa thought that it would be much more fun if she went out with a friend. So she phoned my mum and said, let's do it. And my mother jumped at the chance because at last some adventure. And her mother was very happy because at that time, the British officers, whether they were civil or military officers stationed in India, it was not thought proper for them to marry local wives. So they were supposed to marry nice British girls. So any British girls coming out to visit India...
I'm sure there's a lot of anticipation.
Tended, I think so, yes.
On the men's side is like...
I think so. And there was a sort of saying among the mothers who were trying to get their daughters married off, oh my dear, you never buy a girl a return ticket to India, implying that as soon as she gets there, she'll get snapped up by some lonely tea planter somewhere. And that's what my mother hoped. That's what my grandmother hoped for my mother.
And how old was she at that time when she decided to go?
She was 23 when she first came.
Oh, so she was fairly young.
Yeah.
But back then, she'd been fairly old. She'd be marriageable
Back then
age.
It was married, you would be marriageable age. By the time you were 30, you were over the hill, so-called on the shelf. You'd passed your sell-by date.
Isn't it crazy? It's fascinating because that mentality for the most part still hasn't changed. The idea is still that if you're over 30 here as a woman, like your market value has gone down as well. Some ideas and some philosophies truly never change, especially when it comes to a woman's age. But sorry, going back to it. So she was 23 when she came in. She was with her Scottish friend and they wanted her for the cocktail and dinner parties.
And then again, there were more cocktail and dinner parties. But every evening, and she describes this beautifully in her book, every evening down from the hills around would come all the ladies from the various villages dressed in their traditional costumes and beautiful colours with all their vegetables. And that she found completely magical and was fascinated by that. And the diversity of peoples, the colour, the sense of a totally different culture, all that captivated her. But then she got an invitation from either the civil doctor or the civil engineer, because generally foreigners, unless you were in the administration, were not allowed to tour in the hills. There was a sort of partly a protective attitude towards the protective paternalistic attitude towards the hill people by the government. I suppose there was also safety considerations, but unless you were an official, you were not supposed to tour in the hills.
Could you just expand more on that? Why did they feel a paternal protection towards the people in the hill stations?
Well, you come across it in the texts. The later administrators were very, very concerned that the culture of the hill tribes should not be corrupted by Western influences. I mean, they were actually against the missionaries. They were against the missionaries because the missionaries started to say that people should wear clothes and that their jewelry was the work of Satan and this kind of thing. So the administrators sort of were terribly protective about the Hill people, about them not.
So did that come from a genuine concern for them as well?
Yes, I mean, it's people can argue about this, and there's a lot of argument about colonialism. Nagas now say, or some scholars might say, well, they wanted to keep us frozen in aspect, frozen in time.
Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it, because what we've seen throughout history, and the reason why I asked if it's genuine concern is because we've always been taught if it sounds and feels like genuine concern, there always seems to be a hidden agenda. They had their own ambitions when it came to not wanting other individuals to go into that specific area of land.
It depends who it is, but sometimes it became too paternalistic. So they ended up perhaps treating the Hill people a little bit like children, which goes with it being paternalistic. Where it came from, I think, was not from some sort of nasty hidden agenda. Of course, they were servants of the British Crown, sort of administrators who came especially to the Naga Hills, did really care. Whether they expressed that care in the right or wrong way is another question, but they did actually care. I believe so, but I'm British, so maybe I've got a bias, so we must acknowledge that.
Right. And so when she was there for, you said 3 weeks, right?
And then she got this chance to go touring in the hills with the local doctor, with the civil surgeon, I think it was. And he used to go into as most of the administrators did, because there was, of course, no kind of medical help in the hills. So if you got a really bad case of a really bad infection, Naga sores, as they were called, which I think they perhaps started out with an insect bite or something, and then the sore would eat away the flesh. And they were very difficult to treat with local medicines. It was popular. Villagers used to queue up when they knew that the official was coming in order to get treatments. So it was popular, and it was a way of making friends with the village. So, I mean, that's one of your double-edged examples. There was a hidden agenda, but they were actually also trying to help.
Well, I would imagine also the fact that they had this medicine, and in the villagers' eyes, you guys might have looked like magicians. The fact that you brought all these, sort of medication, and you were able to heal something that in their eyes was essentially a death sentence for them.
And it was tough because they had to go, uphill and downhill and uphill and downhill.
She talks about it. She talks about how it's like zigzags.
It looks zigzag, yes.
Literally as they're going up the hill.
Absolutely. And however tough it was, she just thought and she felt kind of at home. She thought, this is it. This is where I want to be. I want this to be my future. After she'd done sort of 2-3 trips, and she'd really spent all her money invested in cameras and everything, and got herself, and she came back to Manipur, and she was told that she would not be allowed to tour in the hills. Somehow some political, there'd been some political shift, and she nearly had a nervous breakdown. She had so much of her hopes and dreams into this trip and into really making a career as an amateur anthropologist. Then, after a month or two of bitter disappointment, she went to see Philip Mills in Shillong, and he suggested that she could go not in the Naga Hills or in Manipur, but she could go to North Kachar, now in Assam. And he had a hidden agenda there because this particular community had recently rebelled against the British. And it was obvious, and this is the whole saga of Rani Gaidinliu, which I won't go down that avenue, but Rani Gaidinliu had led the rebellion against the British. And Rani Gaidinliu was arrested.
And sort of there was that fascination with the connection between Rani Gaidinliu and your mom.
Yes.
People mistook it because they were fairly the same age, around the same age. And there was sort of this, the prophecy was that there was this tall, angelic kind of individual that would rise. And your mom sort of became the embodiment of that. The term Naga Queen, would you say originated from that?
No, I don't think so. I think that was later during the war.
Okay, so
I
that's a
think
misnomer.
of course, a complete misnomer, and my mother hated that label, but of course it's been picked up by any sort of popular press or things.
It's an amazing catchphrase to put on a headline.
But well, exactly. That's why it was so popular, and it kind of plays on that old film African Queen of the 30s and 40s. That would be a catchphrase then, but my mother hated it. I mean, I spent a lot of effort whenever anybody wants to do anything about my mother to persuade them not to use that phrase, but it keeps popping up. But I think, yes, I mean, it does, of course, Rani Gaidinliu, Queen Gaidinliu, she was regarded as a queen. What she said about the tall angelic figure, I believe that what it was that when Gaidinliu was finally arrested after a terrific chase all over the mountains, she said to her followers, "Don't worry, I will return to you. They're only imprisoning, this shape you see here.
This physical form.
But I will come back to you in another form. So don't worry, just keep looking out for me."
Right.
They were about the same age, and Gaidinliu was quite stocky. My mum, like me, was quite she had broad shoulders. She was quite sort of strongly built. Therefore, in the minds of the people there were some people who were desperate for. I mean, Gaidinliu inspired adoration among some of her followers, many of her followers, I believe. Her religion was promising salvation, so there was that power. When my mum pulled up, some people thought that indeed that she was this reincarnation, or not exactly reincarnation, but an avatar, another form of Gaidinliu, and insisted on kind of kneeling down in front of her and worshipping her, which was extremely embarrassing.
Well, it would make sense, because if you were an avid follower of Rani Gaidinliu, that wouldn't have just been coincidence. You see someone like that, a tall, a Western white woman, you think it's happening for a reason. Absolutely.
No, it does I agree. It makes sense. No, I don't. I think we can't say they were crazy.
Right.
They were. It was a natural reaction, but not everyone. Opinions were split. Not everybody was an avid fan of Gaidinliu. There were a group who were, and a group who weren't. The group who were avid fans wouldn't leave her alone. I mean, she couldn't even have a bath without somebody coming in with a chicken in a basket. But the other group remembered the sins of the British and the maladministration that had gone on over the famines. I mean, I haven't told you the whole story of the famines, but there was real maladministration, because the officers, while the Naga Hills area, this area, had pretty good high caliber colonial officers, that area, the Kachar area, had inferior colonial officers who made these terrible mistakes and exacerbated the famine.
Right. But why do you think that was? Was just because that area was more remote and less valuable as opposed to the Nagaland area?
Yes, I think it's a sort of slight snob value thing here, that the Kachar settlement was a tea planters and it was a railway colony. So it was not quite so prestigious in a way. I think perhaps mainly because tribes in the Naga Hills had fought so hard against the British in the beginning. So it was perceived that they were rather stronger communities up here, whereas the communities in North Kachar didn't need such careful handling. They were poor relatively, because of this infertile land and a struggle to survive. So they weren't seen as a threat. So they weren't seen as a threat, exactly. So they tended to put in somewhat second-rate officers, and the ones that were second-rate did a lot of damage. And that's what sort of led to the famine and the uprising of these individuals. Exactly. Wow. And then so when your mom was, I think, the fascination with that term Naga Queen, originally it came from such a weird cultish type of origin. But I think later on, a lot of individuals, especially the people around her, they started using it as a term of endearment for her and for what she had actually done.
So as much as your mom actually didn't like that term, I think a lot of people found a sense of comfort in giving her that title. Sorry, continue on with your story. The fact that she, after Gaidinliu.
Yes, so you've got these two groups. You've got the ones who are giving her offerings all the time and never leaving her in peace. I mean, just simply to retire into the jungle for the call of nature was a problem, because somebody would follow her. I mean, it was really difficult. And Gaidinliu had the same thing. She apparently said when she got into prison, she told Mr. Mills that, well, at least I can have a bath, because she'd been, bothered in the same way, being worshipped at every possible moment. But then there were the other group who were totally anti. That included Namkia, her interpreter, who later became her absolute support and bodyguard and help, and she couldn't have done what she did without him. But in the beginning, he was very anti, and so were a number of others. So she would go to a village and people would turn their backs on her. And she's thinking, what on earth is going on? I don't get these people at all. It was not at all like the experiences she'd had in Manipur, where she'd just been going to the village with the medicine chest and taking some photographs and everything. But here in Laisong, she was trying to live. In Manipur, she was on tour, just trekking and then going back to Imphal. In Laisong, she had to set up a camp and live in the community. She had to learn the customs. She had to work to be accepted. That was a difficult phase, and she describes that just slowly, that wall began to dissolve.
Was there a certain incident that broke that wall? I know you said it was slow, but was there like an incident?
I don't think so. I think she just woke up one day and kind of realised that instead of being on the outside looking in, she was on the other side looking out. So when she went on the occasions when she left the village and went to the local town or went to Kolkata, even more, she was looking at her own culture as if it was on the other side of the wall.
Like reverse culture shock?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, exactly.
That's fascinating. So she had essentially adopted this culture and it had become her, and that her old culture had become alien to her in a lot of ways.
Yes, I mean, she had pretty thoroughly integrated, and probably most important element in that is the fact that she learned the language quickly, to the extent that she was actually dreaming. She had stopped dreaming in English and she started dreaming in Zeme. And then, of course, there's the war. And Battle of Kohima was 1944. The British became very concerned that they were heading for India. The Japanese were heading for India and wanting to take India. Nobody knew which way the Japanese would try to enter India. Would they come up here towards Kohima, or would they go further south through Manipur into the area where my mother was? Because previously that area, Laisong, was a complete backwater. Nobody went there. It wasn't an important place or a significant place at all. But where my mum's village was, a lot of tracks, and her village, Laisong, was a lot of the tracks were sort of crossing and converging. Also, she was just in front of railway station at Mahur. The thing was that once the Japanese got to a railway, then they can get to Delhi. The same deal for coming through to Kohima. It's the way to Dimapur. At Dimapur, there were massive supplies and armaments, food, everything you need for war. And you can jump on a train and go to Delhi and then, take India. In that case, suddenly, Laisong, little forgotten place, becomes strategically important. One problem was, a concern for the British was, what would the Nagas do? If the Nagas could easily side with the Japanese, then the British would be in serious trouble.
My question to that is, were the Nagas even aware of the context of the war that they were even in?
No, I'm sure they weren't. News would have got about. But when the Japanese turned up at a village and said, "You don't want to be we look like you. We're your brothers. You don't want to be under these British guys. We'll give you a much better life. So, I mean, that could happen. And I mean, it did happen in Manipur. The Kuki communities in particular supported the Japanese. So, I mean, if that had happened all along the frontier, then the British would have been sunk. And there was particular concern about the Zeme, which you'll guess why, because they just recently rebelled under Rani Gaidinliu. Now, it was known that my mum had, over the 2 years, had forged, she'd finally broken through these barriers. And there was a famine sometime in the early times she was there. And instead of dealing with it in the really appalling way that the previous officers had dealt with it, in that they gave famine relief, free rice to the villagers. The villagers said, thank you very much. But what the officers didn't tell them was that they would come back later and ask for money for it, quite a lot of money, after the famine was over. To such an extent, some people had to sell their land. So after those incidents, the villagers said, right, we will not take any free handouts, because there won't be free handouts. My mum and Maurice Perry, the good officer, they went out and persuaded people to take the rice, which, I mean, they were very reluctant to do, and said, look, there are no strings attached. This time it's for real. And I think that, and the fact she was a woman, and the fact that, and so in one way not a threat, and the fact that she wasn't officially government was also helpful.
She was sort of like that bridge between two worlds.
Yes, I mean, it came, and that's why the authorities took this very peculiar step, really. But because she'd done such a good job in forming a bond with the local people and they trusted her, she was recruited to lead 150 intelligence scouts called V-Force.
V-Force,
yeah, which was their job was just to patrol and look out for Japanese spies coming through and to check anybody who was coming through the area. Anyone who was coming through the area had to have a pass. And the scouts, 150 scouts.
Local scouts?
Yes, I mean, Nagas. Okay. Oh, yeah, I mean, that's the point. That's what V-Force did. It recruited people who understood the local culture. So sometimes they were tea planters. The people who'd lived in the areas for quite a long time really kind of comprehended how things worked locally.
How did she convince these V-Force members? How did she convince the locals that this wasn't just the British people's war, but it's your war too?
With great difficulty.
I'm sure, because the first question is, this isn't our fight. This is your fight. Why are you dragging us into your mess?
Absolutely. She couldn't have done it without the redoubtable Namkia, who at the beginning, wanted nothing to do with her really and was furious that he'd been appointed her interpreter, then became her very best friend. And absolute, bedrock of support. He was quite pro-British, and he did a very good job of convincing the local people. Some of the villages that Namkia tried to recruit from were saying, no, you'll send us away, we'll die in some foreign land, you're trying to trick us.
Right.
So my mother tried to swear that, no, this time this is not it, you'll be working here, you'll just be working as scouts, going through the jungle, trying to see if anybody's coming in.
Did they ever directly engage with Japanese troops? Was there ever instances of that? I know they're a surveillance group, but were there ever instances where they had to have like direct contact with them?
I don't think my mother's group did. The only combat they saw was, all the time you had this stream of refugees coming through from Burma in a terrible state. That's a whole other awful story. And you also had a lot of deserters from the lower rank Indian soldiers, Jawans probably. So they would be looting Naga villages. It had a disastrous effect on the villages, of course. Of course, remember, they haven't got much to eat anyhow, so all these people coming through and stealing stuff was not good news at all.
So there were more engagement with local deserters than with Japanese forces?
Yes, but their mission was always intelligence. Their mission was intelligence. And when it was realised how close they were, there was a rumour that a patrol of 50 Japanese soldiers had moved into my mother's area. So then they were meant to be in combat mode, but they never found them. They went looking for them. I mean, she was active. She carried a Sten gun. Yes.
Oh, wow, that's
yes.
very different than surveillance now.
Yeah, it is. It is. The whole game has changed.
Right.
And by the time the 50 Japanese soldiers are supposed to be in her area, she's actually on or even behind the front line. The front line has moved, and so a sergeant comes one day to give her this news, and I mean, it's a tremendous shock. It's a huge shock, but the fact that she and her group were there was, I think, a deterrent. The Japanese were looking for her. There were surveillance planes going over all the time, and she used to hide. You know how granaries, Naga granaries, well, many granaries in this part of the world are slightly raised up to stop the rats getting in. So there's a space underneath. So I was told that when planes came over, she used to dive under the granaries so that she couldn't be hidden. And the Japanese put a price on her head because she was known to be the leader of the unit and that perhaps it would fall apart if she wasn't there. They gave money to some of the Nagas in advance to take her head.
How much was the bounty?
No, I can't remember. But I know someone had taken an advance payment. But he was given something like 45 rupees, which had been a huge amount at that time. And she later met this gentleman, and she was very much tempted to say, well, can I have the money because I've got my head, you haven't. But she left it at that. But they had, I mean, it sounds terrifically dramatic, but she and Namkia had this arrangement that if the Japanese really got too close, then he was to cut off her head and present it to the Japanese so that they would leave the villagers alone. It's all very dramatic.
That's such a crazy thing. Stuff. Yeah, my goodness. I think most of us would just be satisfied with a bullet to the head. But like the fact that she wanted her own head cut off. Whoa. Who knows what your mom could have seen in the front lines, for her to come to a decision like that.
Oh, yeah, it was desperate. It was desperate time.
Did it in some way at that point, was it still an adventure for her?
Oh, who's to say? But what I suspect is that it appealed to the adventurous part of her then. Would she be able to raise these scouts? So there would have been the practical challenges on the one hand, but mixed with a sense of excitement that she's been given this responsibility and that it is real adventure. And she was always terrified. She was told that the appointment was temporary, that she would eventually be replaced by a male officer when one became available. But in practice, no one became available. And so she was very, very conscious that she was a woman and an anomaly in this situation. And any minute she might be pulled out and sent off, as she put it, to a typing pool in Delhi. And she was really afraid of that. So, the adventurous bit is still there. She doesn't want to let go of this adventure. This is her adventure now. But I think at the point when things got really serious and she got that news that she was actually, instead of being well in front of the front line, she was actually slightly behind it. I think then the reality of it would have kicked in. Then suddenly they could never sleep. That she gets the news that the Japanese are after her head, and she's aware of it because of all the planes going over. It suddenly becomes all too real, and they can never sleep 2 nights in the same place. Every night they've got to move somewhere else. She can never go home. I mean, they're hiding out in the jungle because seriously, the Japanese are looking for her.
And that only just increases that sense of paranoia as well, just moving every 2 nights into a new area and constantly just watching over your shoulder. I know there's a live adaptation of your mom's life, but is there a movie?
Keep trying to get a movie made.
It has all the attributes and the genres of a movie that you would want.
Well, Jonathan, I completely agree. I've been trying since my mother died, I've been trying to get, which is 1988, I've been trying to get a movie made. How I want to pitch it is because all the time she was fighting the patriarchy, with her family, not being sent to university. Her commanding officer, Colonel Scott, said to her once, the problem for you is that it's very hard being a woman. You're always wrong twice, once for being wrong and once for being a woman. And that's how kind of things were in that, if she made the slightest mistake, then it would be immensely magnified. She's a woman and she's incompetent. So she was always on tenterhooks about that.
The culmination of the years that it wasn't possible for you to make this film, I think now is the right climate, I feel like, to make that movie.
But it needs big money.
Yeah.
It would be a very expensive movie to make. But I mean, we've even had Bollywood contact me, but I didn't want to go down that route.
Right, because they have their own agenda and how they want to frame the movie. And I think Rani Gaidinliu would probably be a good center point in that movie as well, for sure.
Yes, I mean, if you're going to make a drama, somebody's got to be the baddie. And a number of my relatives contributed to my mother's early difficulties, having to leave school early, not being allowed to go to university, her dreams shattered in that respect. So there are members of the family who are at fault there. What are they going to say if their grandfather or their grandmother is
depicted in that way?
Is depicted in such a negative way? So negotiating that, I mean, it's quite a nightmare.
Oh my goodness, because everyone has their own story. It's almost like, my goodness, how can anything get done? You know what I mean? When you have just a number of these individuals being involved.
Exactly, and to create drama, it's how that's done without creating a travesty of the truth or.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm not a screenwriter, but I would imagine the over-looming villain would be the Japanese. Bring them in. You don't have to use actual characters, but the fact that you said that there were a lot of individuals who were in her way when it came to getting certain positions. No one's going to get offended if you put a male officer in there.
Yes, exactly. It
would be an amazing watch.
It's a great story, Jonathan. I really, really know, not just that it's my mum's story, but because I've been through this and talked to so many people about it, I know it's a really good story and I wish somebody would make the film.